if the White House is interested, it doesn't mean that you have a spy game going. Key individual, Jim Woolsey, was the director of CIA, and he actually asked the question. And just because he was interested doesn't mean there was institutional interest within the agency. And one of the key ones, and we keep coming back to these reports, just because you find ancient reports does not translate to institutional interest today. Now, he actually, Woolsey asked the question internally that said, hey, what's going on? And Gerald Haynes, who was with NRO, National Reconnaissance Organization, historian, got the task. And this is what he came back with. Actually, the guy some of you may know, John Peterson, runs the Arlington Institute, was a personal friend of Woolsey, said, hey, what about this? Why are these things redacted? He sent out a note and said, what's going on internally? And the answer basically was not very much. Now, one of the things that was interesting is that they found a memo in there talking about an emergency response team. But the caveat also was equally interesting. It says, oh, by the way, they have never met. And the bottom line from Haynes was, like the JFK trial and relationship to CIA, UFOs will probably never go away no matter what you say or do. I really like Stan Friedman. As you know, we debated here last time. I think he does excellent research. But look at the reports that they come on. Does anybody have any reports that are not nearly half a century old? So in the ergofusion, you say, because back in antiquity, in a time when we were really worried about the Soviet Union, and the issue there that came up was, is there a technology that's dramatically advanced of where we are? And if it's not ours, is it Soviet, ergo changes the geopolitical balance of the world to where we are today? But who believes in a potential cover-up? Turns out the vast majority of the people do. About 70% of the population actually believe that there is a cover-up. So you also, some of you heard about the Cometa report. Podesta did make a statement saying, I wish the information would be made public. Ed Mitchell, a personal friend, great American hero, we agree to disagree on this one. But he also says, I believe the government is covering these things up.
As you know, and as I always say, I am a journalist. My mind is journalistic. I work with evidences, hard evidences, something that is possible to investigate. Since 1991 and after the total solar eclipse in Mexico City, we realized that the video, then as VHS and Betamax, was already in the hands of so many millions of people, not just in Mexico, but around the world, that probably video would help to demystify, to make real this UFO phenomenon. Right now it's amazing what is happening regarding to UFOs and videos. There are sky watchers, not just in Mexico or Phoenix, where everything started as sky watchers, but around the world. Very recently in Russia, now in Japan, and other places where this phenomenon is very constant. And now there are people, some of them very specialized, recording UFOs everywhere. And that's what brought me here, to show you what is going on around the world right now. I mean, because as we know, there are many shows, UFO shows in the television, but very few of them present what is happening today or last week or 2 months ago. And I believe that's what people want to know, the reality of this phenomenon. I know that through the past we went from abductions to contactees. But right now, I believe that the most important evidence is what is possible to prove to images in video or even digital photographs.
Okay, Life magazine did an article which was talked about in one of these newspaper articles that's in this book. The remarkable article that was published in April, I think it was 1952, was one of these in-depth articles that Life did. And this newspaper article is commenting on it, saying that the UFO that was the subject of it, at 50,000 feet, going 1,800 miles an hour, no aircraft, no rocket, no guided missile could ever make such a vertical descent. Now this is significant because back then there was no Photoshop, there was no software trickery, so the things that were reported that did make it into the newspaper could not be explained away so easily as it is today. These videos just leave everybody in confusion because you don't know if it was made by a 14-year-old in his garage or if it really was a couple on their honeymoon in Maui. So it sort of fostered a lot of discussion, and I wanted to see what the cover of that Time magazine was, and funny enough, Marilyn Monroe was on there, and at the top it says, "There is a case for interplanetary saucers." And I thought that was interesting because there is this rumor that Marilyn Monroe knew about the issue of UFOs and was going to do a press release, and that's maybe why she's no longer with us. Again, that is a whole different story, but let's go back to the headlines here. This was in one of these headlines. This is, of course, Paul Trent, the famous photograph of a UFO, and I think that's the first time I've ever seen a picture of Paul Trent. And this was in the Sunday Dispatch, and it made a lot of headlines. In fact, it was such a credible UFO case that it started like being bounced around the experts. And one of the experts was Arthur C. Clarke, author, legendary futurist. He wrote 2001, Space Odyssey, inventor of the communication satellite. He says, in reference to Paul Trent's photographs, there's nothing in the whole aeronautical field which gives a clue about this pictured object. It makes one wonder if there are extraterritorial visitors. We can neither prove nor disprove such a theory till one lands. They may be revolutionary types of craft. They may be extraterritorial. We shall have to certainly achieve spaceflight in the next 50 years or so. Others may have done so before us. Clean, simple, and everything you would expect from Arthur C. Clarke.
This is Paolo Di Girolamo, who was involved in the so-called amicizia case. Amicizia is Italian for friendship. And so it was that they recruited people from all walks of life, scientists, I think a few politicians at any rate, artists, to become involved in this amicizia organization, which was set up in Italy in the mid-1950s, and it continued for several decades. Also, similar friendship groups were set up in other countries around the world, even as far as Chile. In fact, in Chile, they had a base there, which they called Friendship Island, because amicizia, Italian for friendship. And there were many people involved. This is Gaspare da Lama, a famous Italian painter. I think he's still alive to this day. He was involved for a short period, 1960 to 1965, in the amicizia, the friendship organization. And he had meetings with these people, and he took several photographs. And here's one photograph of their craft. The types of scout ships that the amicizia group used were relatively small. I would say no more than about 12 feet in diameter, and some of them were smaller. This is an extraordinary man, Professor Stefano Breccia. I had 2 meetings with him in Italy several years ago. Sadly, he died a few years back. A great man, quite an extraordinary man. My girlfriend accompanied me on this trip, and she's not that mad about flying saucers and aliens, but when she met this guy, she said he's the most sincere man. You know, we both said we could bet our lives on him. Extraordinary man. He was a pilot. He'd addressed the what used to be the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He'd addressed many prestigious organizations around the world. And he actually took, on one occasion, a ride in one of these craft, which he found rather boring as a pilot. But some of those guys that were involved for decades became quite blasé about the entire situation. And there's Stefano as a young man at the time that he was recruited into the so-called Amicizia group. And Stefano took quite a number of photographs of these craft in the Monte Silvano area, and there's one of them. As I say, in my opinion, no more than about 12 feet in diameter.
They bought me a telescope, and I would go and set it up at night, cold out, wintry day, and I remember the first time I saw Saturn, the little rings, and I was just into it. I couldn't stop. And a couple weeks later, my mother brought me a book. Walter Sullivan, it was the late New York Times science writer. It was called We Are Not Alone. And it was about life, extraterrestrial life, the fact that we were not alone in this universe. And this young man, 15, 16 years old, could not get enough of UFOs and the unexplained. And I decided at that young age I wanted to go into broadcasting. I'm going to uncover these stories. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to unravel them. I'm going to interview the people who know what they're talking about when it comes to life out there in the universe. And I did. At 21 years old, I was a radio reporter in Detroit. And those of you who listen to Coast may know this story. My very first radio interview, 21 years old, 1971, was Stanton Friedman. Very first one. Amazing. And you know what? I've aged since 1971. If you look at Stanton Friedman then and now, the guy hasn't aged a bit. He is an extraterrestrial. But it was a great interview. But I had to fight my news director tooth and nail to do this. I saw this little clipping in the Detroit News, and it said, Stanton Friedman, former nuclear physicist, is going to be talking at a university about UFOs. And I said, I'm going to go cover this. And the news director says, no, you're not, George. There are fires and city council meetings and murders we need to cover in Detroit. I'm not going to cover UFOs. And I said, well, I'm going to do it on my own time then. And he said, go ahead. And I went out there and I interviewed Stan, and I have never stopped interviewing Stan. He's been a great interview. And you know how Stan talks when he gets going. As a matter of fact, the question that I asked him back in 1971, if we see him tonight at the banquet, and I'm sure we will, he'll still be giving us the final part of the answer.